We're back. Welcome again to the Malcolm Roberts Show. Our aims are to restore our country and our planet for humans to abound and flourish. Now, we've had a long break from this show due to a hectic parliamentary schedule late last year and extensive travelling while listening with constituents around the state. First, I want to thank you for having me as your guest in your kitchen, car, shed, lounge, barbecue, wherever you're listening to this, or wherever you are right now, sitting, standing, driving, walking, running, laying down, exercising, whatever you're doing. Our show has two main themes, and these are freedom, specifically freedom replacing control, the eternal human struggle within each of us and between many of us. And secondly, responsibility, specifically personal responsibility and integrity. And the freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. History repeatedly proves that both are essential for human progress and for people's livelihoods. Well, the tax cuts have certainly gone over like a lead balloon, haven't they? They're tiny compared with higher costs of energy, mortgages that the Liberal Labor Uni Party have both been pushing for several years now. We'll see today how the supposed tax cuts are tiny compared with extra costs of living, especially electricity prices. We'll get right into that. Last week, I visited Ravenshoe on the Atherton Tableland in far north Queensland, and I saw again the horrific industrial wind projects. I met a wonderful man called Stephen Nowakowski. I also visited the Bloomfield devastation and took supplies to stranded people who are victims of the floods up in far north Queensland before Christmas. We won't talk about that now. We might talk about it later. I've already made posts about it. We also visited Coombalumba hydropower project to look at the possibility of increasing the capacity at minimal cost. I had forums in Innisfail, Tully, Ravenshoe, Atherton, and I want to thank everyone who participated. Cairns News reporter, who was at the Atherton presentation, said that the Atherton presentation was the biggest political meeting on the North Coast for 5 years. Cairns was postponed to the future because we were stranded in Cape York on the floods. I also remind people that we're still to have a chat with Pat Masidi, whose family home was invaded on the Gold Coast with people wielding machetes and knives. Now, I admire people who are passionate and devoted, especially those few who see or learn contradictory facts, and then they pause, ask questions of themselves and of others, do their research, and then change their view, especially when those views were previously held passionately. That's a sign of a strong character and a strong intellect and a good heart. People who wake up, question themselves, research, get the data, get the facts. Our guest today saw the damage that the ideology he followed was causing. He questioned himself. He woke up to a scam being perpetrated on every Australian. In our conversations, his research skills and knowledge really impressed me up in North Queensland, as did his approach and his attitude and his sincerity. I want to welcome Steve Nowakowski. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Malcolm. Thanks for having me this morning. Yeah.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for being here, and thank you for changing the schedule at the last minute. Tell me something you appreciate, mate. Anything at all.
Well, first and foremost, it's family. You know, family is the bedrock of my life. It's it grounds you. It provides everything that one needs. But beyond family, it's our natural world, and I've always had a deep affinity with nature. And I suppose it comes back to where I grew up. Grew up in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney. And it was an era where I could just jump over the back fence and wander and walk and follow creek lines and find waterfalls and catch tadpoles and watch them turn into frogs and catch fish and so forth. So it's those simple freedoms, I suppose, that I find very special and sacred. And that connection with nature has been a bedrock of my life. And I don't think if I can't connect with nature, well, then there's something missing in my life. So something that really that I'm really connected to is biodiversity, nature, wild places. Yeah. So
wonderful. Thank you. You reminded me of part of my upbringing. I was born in India, and we came to Australia when I was 7. And then after about 2 years, we went to the Hunter Valley, And I remember going out into the bush with just my dog, or sometimes with friends that had come in from town. We lived in the bush, and sometimes it would be with on a horse, sometimes on just a push bike, sometimes walking up and down mountains, into creeks, caves. It was just wonderful, and I think humans are blessed when we're in touch with nature, and we have something missing when we're not. So
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it
I want to
definitely recharges one's batteries. Getting out in the bush. Yeah.
Well and truly, and it keeps us on the path, I think, also, and keeps us in touch with what's really important. Now, Stephen is a greenie. He's a greenie with some brains, and because he's a genuine greenie, and I have so much time for genuine greenies because they're conservationists at heart. They're protectors of the environment. They understand, as Stephen does, that human civilization depends upon, the future of our civilization depends upon preserving the natural environment. But the natural environment, also the future of the natural environment, depends upon human civilization because we minimize our impact. He was an active Greens Party supporter. He was bought into supporting wind and solar until an event that led Stephen to ask questions of himself. What was that event, Stephen? Why did you suddenly wake up and start questioning?
Well, look, I marched the streets for climate action up until 5 years ago, and we can talk about that later in terms of CO2. But what changed everything for me was a number of sequential events. And the first event was the construction of the Mount Emerald wind farm. And the Mount Emerald wind farm is only...
Can you tell everyone where that is?
Yeah, it's only about 30 minutes west of Cairns. So it's up on what we call the Atherton Tablelands, the northern Atherton Tablelands, west of Cairns. The wind farm back then, when it was proposed back in 2015 and 2016, it was the first industrial scale wind farm for Queensland. So myself in the conservation sector, embraced this project because I was told to believe, or led to believe, that this would power 70,000 homes. It would reduce carbon emissions. And this is what we need to embrace. And I believe that. And there was a bit of pushback by certain conservationists up here, and they knew the environmental significance of that particular area where this wind farm was going into. And I'd previously bushwalked across this spot where the Mount Emerald wind farm was going to go, and had some beautiful moments there with family and bushwalking colleagues and botanists. It was a beautiful place. It was a remnant plateau of forest that had never been touched, and even cattle had never gone in there. So pristine condition because of its remote access, hard access, and the fact that it was very poor soils up on this mountain range, that agriculture had never penetrated into this area. So therefore, there was still threatened species there. Five endangered plant species are found on this area, and also one of the best population of northern quolls. And even I was happy to sacrifice that for this wind farm because that's what we need to do. And so the construction of that wind farm started, and then I was engaged to photograph certain aspects of the construction phase of this wind farm. And I was gobsmacked by the scale. Nothing could really prepare me for the scale, because we all imagine that a wind farm goes into a clapped out sheep paddock, or this is what we're told. This is what we're told, or it goes into a Scandinavian rolling hills in Scandinavia, where there's social license and everyone's happy and the sheep graze happily underneath. And that's what we're told. So we have these preconceived ideas of what a wind farm is. And it's not a wind farm, it's a wind factory. And so we have these preconceived ideas. And you have to remember, this was the first wind factory in Queensland. So we were none the wiser. I was naive, completely.
And also, just to interrupt briefly and let you keep going, it's in God's country. I mean, North Queensland and the hinterland behind Cairns is just stunningly beautiful.
Well, that's right. You know, some of our best remnant forests left in Australia are found up here. The wet tropics region of North Queensland are the most highly biodiverse areas in Australia. And I was naive enough to think, well, that's okay to sacrifice. This beautiful mountaintop area we can sacrifice that for this renewable project. And then when I started photographing and documenting what was going on, and what they physically do is brutal. They dynamite out the ridgelines, heavy machinery, civil earth moving, blasting off the tops of really steep ridgelines to get really big components for these wind turbines up there. So these turbine blades for Mount Emerald were 57 metres long. We have to remember the current generation of wind farms today, the Shallumban Wind Farm, the High Road Wind Farm, Upper Burdekin Wind Farm, the Mount Fox Wind Farm, Moa Creek, Moonlight Range Wind Farm.
That's a lot.
Hopeful, it goes on and on. The Boomer Range Wind Farm, Lotus Creek Wind Farm. You've got Clark Creek Stage 1, Stage 2 wind farms. Those wind farms are double the size of what I documented at Mount Emerald. So the Mount Emerald wind farm, the blade lengths were 57 metres long. This new generation, they're 89 metres or 99 metres long, so nearly twice the length. So even more civil earth moving needs to be required in these new generation wind factories. And okay, so the wind factory was built, and we lost a lot of really good habitat, and the data is now slowly coming in that we're losing lots of wedge-tailed eagles and bats, and the biodiversity of that once beautiful area is now diminishing. So that data is coming in. So that's something that we're now aware of. But then when it was built, I started looking at the data of what the energy generation of what is coming out of that energy plant, and it's completely dismal. And it does not power 70,000 homes. And so it powered 70,000 homes for 1 hour in the year 2022. So I went and looked at the data for that Mount Emerald wind factory, and it's all easy to find. It's all publicly available. And I put all that data into an Excel spreadsheet and analysed the data. And for 66 days in the year 2022, cumulatively, it generated zero electricity.
So that's 1/6. It's more than 1/6 of a year.
That's right, yeah.
So for 2 months, it generated zero electricity.
That's right. And then for another 3 months of the year, it generated less. I don't have the graph here, but it generated less than 15 or 20 megawatts of capacity at any given time.
And what was the stated capacity of this complex?
So, well, onshore wind farms, and I didn't know any of this when this was being built. This is how, the naivety of now reached reality that onshore wind farms overseas can reach capacity factors of, say, 35%. This is a 180 megawatt wind factory. So 35% of that is what is supposed to be delivered. But when I looked at the data, it only generated 18.1% of median output capacity factor for the year 2022. I haven't done the figures yet for 2023. So the output is dismal, and it doesn't generate power for 70,000 homes. And so what that indicates is that
excuse me, Stephen, the figures I understand for across Australia for wind turbines,
yes.
They are averaging around 23% of their capacity, their stated capacity. But at peak hours, when we really need it, it's down around 10% on average.
Well,
so keep going.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And I can't speak for other states. There is a stronger wind resource in places like South Australia on the coast and Victoria, and obviously Bass Strait and coastal regions of New South Wales. But I really don't know. All I've been doing is concentrating on Queensland. Queensland is big enough for someone like myself to try to grapple with. So what I have found is that the wind resource in Queensland is actually really bad, particularly up the Great Dividing Range. Now, there is a good wind resource further west around Hughenden and Forsyth, and down those ranges in Western Queensland, there is a good wind resource there. But you've got to remember, to tap into that wind resource and get a higher capacity factor, we're going to need a lot more transmission infrastructure, and then if you talk to any energy expert, they say that energy generation needs to be near where the energy is being consumed. It's pointless putting out wind farms 1,000 kilometres west of Brisbane or the Gold Coast or Cairns or Rockhampton or Gladstone when it's those coastal areas that are consuming the electricity, because you get transmission loss, and you get about 1% transmission loss per 100 kilometres. So you're going to lose 10% of electricity before it actually reaches the destination on the coast. So you look at the wind modelling data for the coastal ranges and the Great Dividing Range of Queensland, and it's very dismal, and it actually decreases the further north you go. There is a bit
decreases.
There is a bit of a good wind resource here on the Atherton Tableland, but there's a lot of land use conflict on the tableland because of agriculture and high biodiversity and so forth. But it's a very small footprint area, and so this is why we're seeing a cluster of wind farms right here just west of us, such as the High Road Wind Farm, the Schlumberger Wind Farm, Upper Burdekin, Mount Fox wind farms in a very confined area, because there is a little bit of a high wind resource at elevations above 700 meters above sea level. So look, up until 3 years ago, I knew nothing about electricity generation or consumption, and now I'm learning. And I'm not saying that I know everything about energy, but I'm trying to do my best to learn about what is going on. And one thing that has become very evident is that for us to achieve 100% renewables, particularly in Queensland, is completely delusional. It cannot be done. It can be done if we spend $5 to $7 trillion, like what is published in the Net Zero report. So the Net Zero report, which is a really good report, and it's actually been endorsed by the green groups. So the Australian Conservation Foundation, which I used to be a very proud member and supporter of, they support and endorse the Net Zero report. That Net Zero report says for us, Australia-wide, to achieve net zero, we need to spend $1.2 trillion by 2032, and then $5 to $7 trillion by 2050 to achieve our targets. It's complete delusion. That report also tries to map where these renewable energy generation projects should go in lower biodiverse areas of Australia. And it's completely delusional also, because what they're saying is, well, we put in millions and millions of hectares of solar and wind generation right in the middle of Queensland in supposedly low biodiverse areas. But no developer is going to do that unless taxpayers pay for the transmission infrastructure and prop it all up. It's a complete delusion. The Net Zero report clearly says that for Australia to reach net zero, the entire state of Victoria, the spatial area, the size of Victoria would need to be covered in glass and turbines. That's the scale of the spatial footprint. Yeah. So imagine,
and that's not talking about the environmental damage. That's not talking about the human catastrophe. That's not talking about the cost. Just the footprint. And these things are resource hogs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's just the footprint. Yeah. And which is and that's what interests me most about this transition. It's all about footprint because I, I said earlier, I have a passion for biodiversity in wild places. And one of the biggest, the resource that we're losing most globally is wild places. Places that are intact, big chunks of land that still have ecological processes at play that aren't impacted, that haven't been impacted by humankind. And I think those places are necessary, not only for ecological purposes, but also for the human spirit, for us. We need places where we can go into wild valleys and walk mountain tops that are wild and not see human infrastructure in the distance and power lines and wind turbines. And so those places, I believe, need to remain intact. We need wild places. But if we do try to go down this path of 100% renewables, all wild places in Australia are gone. We're going to lose the lot. And that's what scares me the most. The other thing that scares me the most about this whole renewable transition is that there is no endpoint. If someone said, look, we're going to try to achieve a hypothetical goal of 40% of carbon reduction by 2050, and this is a spatial footprint, and there's all this social license, and people are okay with it, well, then I could probably live with that. But the problem that we've got is that we're now talking about hydrogen exports, and we're talking about Australia becoming a global superpower, and that cannot be achieved. It cannot be done because we need to cover, like I said, we need to cover the entire, hypothetically, the spatial footprint for just Australia to become this hypothetical net zero. We need to have a spatial footprint of Victoria. If we start exporting hydrogen, well, then we need to triple that. We need to generate vast amounts of electricity using wind and solar. So we'd need to triple that footprint. And then if we move over to electric vehicles, Elon Musk has made it very clear for the entire globe, the Earth, we have 1.49 billion internal combustion engines in the world right now on Mother Earth. Elon Musk has made it very clear that for us to transition to electric vehicles, we need to triple our electricity generation globally.
That's just for the transition to electric vehicles.
That's right.
That's not all the other base load.
No, not base load. So for us to manufacture steel and aluminium and provide housing and our base load power for us to function as human species in Australia, which is a modern first world nation, well, then we need to triple our electricity generation to provide more electricity to run our vehicle fleet if we convert over to electric. And then if we talk about Australia producing hydrogen to export, well, then we need to double all that. And then if we're talking about Australia becoming a global superpower to export renewable energy, whatever that is, I don't know what that is, well, then double or triple that again. You know
yes,
I mean?
I've just got visions of you sitting up in the Atherton tableland like this, really scrunched up, and the rest of Australia covered in wind turbines and solar panels, and you just hemmed in to what's left of the Atherton tablelands. It's just ludicrous.
Well, it's about future generations enjoying what I enjoyed when I was a child, which is the freedom to walk in a wild place.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a spiritual connection to be in a wild place, a place to
I agree.
It's a place, and I want future generations to be able to experience what I experienced and have that connection with nature without looking across a horizon of wind turbines as far as the eye can see. And that is where we're going. And
yep, and solar panels.
And solar panels. So I didn't mention this, but I've actually got an associate diploma in cartography, which is map making. And so I've got a passion for mapping. And so I've gone a step further and tried to map where these projects are going in Queensland, to try to show people, to try to articulate the messaging that I'm trying to tell Australians and Queenslanders, that if you want renewable energy, well then we're going to have to sacrifice vast amounts of country. And that will include agricultural land, wild places, everything. And like I said earlier, Queensland doesn't have much wind resources along the coastal ranges where the population bases are, where it needs to be consumed. So wind farm companies, wind factory companies are looking at the high elevation areas, the ridgelines and mountaintops of the coastal ranges. And sure enough, my mapping has shown that this is where these proponents are targeting. It's those areas. So there'll be, if all these projects proceed, the drive up the Bruce Highway, up the coast of Queensland, the entire coastal ranges will be covered in turbines for that 2,000 kilometre drive from Brisbane to Cairns, basically.
The other thing, though, Stephen, is that we won't be able to afford to drive because our economy will be smashed. So, you know, just coming back to another parallel, we grew up with similar environments for part of our lives. I used to love being in the bush. I'd be on my own. Mum wouldn't see me after 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd be gone, come back in after dark, you know, just a dog or on a horse. But the other thing was I first started exposing the climate fraud, and I sat down in 2009 after just dedicating entirely voluntarily. My whole working time was exposing this. And I sat down and thought, I'm putting a lot of time into this, and I can see spending a lot of money in this and travel and so on. I thought, why am I doing it? And I remember rattling off 5 different aims. The first one was to protect freedom, because later on I met up with Václav Klaus, who was the president of the Czech Republic and a wonderful economist, and he wrote a book called Blue Planet in Green Shackles. And he documents how the climate fraud was created to shackle us using a green pseudo-environmental cause. So, and he said it was about control, which is what I worked out as well, along with a couple of other friends in Australia. It was to protect freedom. The second one was to protect the natural environment, because I could see what they were doing. The third one was to protect science, to restore science, because they were corrupting science with this nonsense they were peddling. The fourth one was to protect our economy, because I could see what they were doing, putting in place inefficient energy generation. And the fifth one was like you, the protecting the spirit and making sure that humans realize that we are of our natural environment. We are nourished, enriched by our natural environment, and we are not masters of our natural environment. Sure, we can minimize the impacts of floods and so on, but I'm not so arrogant as to believe that we can control nature. So we can certainly affect nature at times. But so they were the main things, like you, that human spirit, number 5 for me out of those 5. But they're fundamental things. And that was back in 2008. And so you were an activist with the Greens. Now you're still an activist, but tell us what you do now.
Yeah, so look, so I'm still very much an activist. And have always been so. It's a part of my DNA. So I was involved with the Greens, and I ran back in 1998 in the seat of Leichhardt, and then again in 2006. And
so Leichhardt's far north Queensland. It's basically Cape York, and
So I've been very involved with the Greens, and the interesting thing is I'm still friends with many people in the Greens, and that has been one of the hardest parts of what I've done in the last 3 years, where I've come out and spoken against a lot of this so-called renewable infrastructure, yet I haven't lost any friends, I don't think. And I think because they know that I'm speaking from the heart and I'm ethical, and I've always put myself at the forefront of campaigns, and I pick the campaigns carefully of what I pick very carefully the campaigns I get involved in. So I've been involved in many campaigns, and I've been arrested 3 times, trying to defend certain forests or certain places from inappropriate development. And I've always stood on the right side of history. And with those campaigns, I still get people on the street patting me on the back and thanking me for being involved in certain campaigns and being arrested and doing that. And I know that the next time I get arrested will be to stop a wind factory. standing in front of bulldozers from clearing pristine forest for a wind factory. So
thank you.
Yeah, and that's what I'll be doing, and I'll be very proud to do that. And I know that I'll be standing on the right side of history because everything that I've read, researched, and witnessed about wind factories and solar farms make no sense. They don't provide meaningful electricity. They have short lifespans. They provide very expensive electricity, as shown around the world. It's not rocket science to look at what's happening globally. The cheapest electricity on Earth is nuclear.
Well, isn't it hydro? Really, it's hydro wherever you can do it. Yes,
hydro is the cheapest. Yes, nuclear provides very cheap retail prices through Europe, and so I was very against nuclear up to 3 years ago. And again, I was brainwashed by the Friends of the Earth and the Australian Conservation Foundation. Those 2 organisations right now are doing a disservice to the natural world, to biodiversity, and to Australians. They need to stop peddling lies about nuclear, because I'm an example of I believe those lies. I believed the fear-mongering around waste, the cost, and so forth. And what I had to do, when I saw the mass destruction of these wind factories and the amount of damage that they do, and the fact that we're going to need millions and millions and millions of hectares of land to try to achieve these so-called targets, I had to seriously look back at nuclear and drop my ideology. So I had to go, okay, everything I've learned about nuclear, everything that I've been told about nuclear, I need to put aside and go back to the fundamentals and read the data, read about Fukushima, read about Chernobyl, read about the different reactor types, and listen to the experts in the industry. And then it became very clear and evident that nuclear is a part of our energy future, I believe. So I'm another example where ideology really stuffed me up for a big portion of my life.
You're a wonderful example, though, Stephen, of someone with the strength of character, the courage and the integrity to question himself and his views, and then to change those views. And not only to change your views, but to go out and bloody well do something about it, to right the wrongs, you know. So that's what I admire.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Because, again, I want my kids to have cheap electricity, abundant electricity, to enjoy the things that we've enjoyed. I want my kids to be able to enjoy wild nature, biodiversity. I don't want to see more species become extinct. And the way we do that is my philosophy right now, where I've come to at the point in my life, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but where I've come to at the point in my life is that, from the research I've done, is that we need, when coal-fired power stations come up for retirement, I'd like to see those being replaced with nuclear facilities, and that way the infrastructure is already there, because the transmission costs, the transmission for renewables is astronomical. So when I talk to energy experts, the logical solution is we will replace retiring coal-fired power stations with nuclear plants, and we can have a very a seamless transition from coal to nuclear if those sites are good. And there's a guy called Peter Parker. He's a nuclear expert. Sorry, the lights have just gone off here. And he's done a lot of research on the transition from coal to nuclear. And he's set up a website and a group called Nuclear for Climate. And I suggest everyone looking at that. And he's done all the heavy lifting in terms of determining the best locations and the best reactor types for Australia and for our use.
So I'm going to jump in there and just say we don't need to get onto this conversation now. I disagree. I agree with your stance on nuclear, by the way. I think that we should be debating it. We should be talking about it, not pretending it doesn't exist. Other countries have done marvelously with nuclear. However, I disagree with your stance on coal. But having said that, and the reason I disagree is there's no evidence for coal affecting the climate as such. There's no evidence. We've got. Well, I won't go into the debate now. That'd be a wonderful conversation with you in the future. I'll send you something about Maurice Strong, the man who concocted this climate sham, climate fraud. But I think what happens with humans is that we didn't end the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We didn't end the Iron Age because we ran out of iron. Yep. We won't end the Coal Age because we run out of coal. The Coal Age will end because we'll come up with a better form of technology. That's human civilization. So I see no reason to dump coal. But having said that, we should be looking at the cheapest form of energy wherever possible. Wherever possible, when we have water, that's hydro. Second, it's still coal, number 2. Nuclear is number 3. There may be some new technologies about to be implemented in nuclear that will transform nuclear. I don't know. I'm not ruling that out. Yes. But so I won't endorse your stance against coal, but I would like you to tell people how you earn a living, because you have no conflicts of interest. I checked him out first. He has no conflicts of interest. He's all self-funded, and so how do you earn a living? Tell us about that, because you're working for free on the environment.
Right. So right now,
activism.
No one's paying me right now. I'm a photographer. So
a bloody good photographer. I've seen his work.
Yeah. So I finished school. So my parents moved from the Blue Mountains and moved up to Brisbane, and I did grade 11 and 12 in Brisbane, and then got a cadetship at the Port of Brisbane on Eagle Street, I think it is, in Brisbane, and I was there. So I got a cadetship. Well, before that, I actually worked in a timber roof truss factory for a year, and then went.
So with your hands?
Yeah, with my hands.
Labouring
with big hydraulic presses, putting gang nails into timber trusses to be used on houses. So I did that for a year to finance university, and then I got a cadetship. So the second, third, fourth year, got a cadetship with Port of Brisbane back when cadetships were available. Yep. This is another thing that I'm really angry about. I think all state government departments, all councils, regional councils should have mandatory apprenticeships. There should be a quota for apprentices. So mechanics, boiler makers, metalwork, and so forth. Electricians. We need apprentices. We need government departments and councils to have apprentices. I got to where I am because of a cadetship with the Port of Brisbane, and they put me through uni part time. So I went to university at night and then worked through the day full time. And so my job. And
by the way, apprenticeships are a strong plank of Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party policy. We've been pushing that for a while. And also I know, I've had a so-called high quality education, tertiary education. I know that for most people, that's not relevant. Most people work with their hands, and especially men and boys, and we love doing things with our hands. and trades are I think the ultimate for men to aspire to. That's why apprenticeships is so important, because it's the best way of teaching children something. That's wonderful.
That's right. Well, it gives kids the security and income, and then the life skills.
Working with their bodies.
Yeah, working with their bodies, interacting with. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. We apprentices, cadetships are very important. So worked at Port of Brisbane, and then worked in the hydrographic section. So the Port of Brisbane, there's a lot of dredging, as you know, in Moreton Bay to allow ships to come into Fisherman Islands. So very involved with the hydrographic surveying and the dredging works for Moreton Bay. But through that period, very involved with the Brisbane Bushwalking Club, and I was leading walks with the Brisbane Bushwalking Club. And I heard about a place called Hinchinbrook Island off the coast of Cardwell.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful.
So I walked Hinchinbrook Island. So I jumped on a train.
It's a big island.
Yeah, so went up there in about, I think it was 1993, and walked the island. And that island changed my life. It was the most beautiful wild place I'd ever seen in my entire life. 40 kilometres of coastline, coconut trees, beach calophyllums, secluded beaches and headlands. And to me, it was complete paradise. And I couldn't believe that such a beautiful, pristine place had been left intact and not impacted upon by humans, which was quite rare along the Queensland coast. That change blew me away. And so I went back to Brisbane, and then started looking for work in North Queensland. I wanted to be closer to the island. So I went back to Brisbane, worked for another year in Brisbane at Port of Brisbane, and then found a job opening at the Cairns Port Authority doing similar work, working in the hydrographic section, doing cartography. And what that involves is measuring the depth of water, and then determining if the water's deep enough for big ships to come in, and then getting dredgers out there to dredge out the shallow areas. That's it. Very simply, that's what it entails. And then, so I worked there for 6 years, and got itchy feet. And meanwhile, I was still bushwalking and photographing, and in my spare time was developing postcards and posters and working on book projects about the natural world and natural history. And then that became quite a big component of my income. I was doing that just in my spare time, in rec leave and weekends. And then, much to the dismay of my parents, gave away my very steady state government job in 2002. And now for 21 years, I've been a freelance photographer.
And his work is superb.
Yes.
It's a natural environment. I've seen his calendar for 2024. It is beautiful. So what's your company called, and how do people get in touch with that?
Well, it's just my name, Stephen Nowakowski Publishing.
Well, hang on. We better spell your name, because it's just your name. It's NOWAKOWSKI.com. Yeah, so visit the website. So I bring out a range of calendars, and there's 12 titles: Coastlines of Australia, Outback of Australia, Icons of Australia, Wild Places of Australia. I do diaries, slimline calendars, perpetual birthday calendars, and I sell around 25,000 of those a year. So that's my bread and butter, and that's my core business. And that enables me to be on the road quite a lot, capturing new imagery. And it's also dovetailed into this whole renewable issue, because it's enabled me to travel around Australia and talk to affected communities. And I'm now working on a documentary with others as well. There's a few others that have joined in, and we're all doing this in a volunteer capacity, working on a documentary to try to expose the renewable energy sector and how it's impacting on the lives of communities and natural ecosystems and wild places. And you'll be one of the speakers, along with myself, at the Renewables rally in Canberra next week, which is Tuesday the 6th of February, starting about 10 o'clock, roughly, in front of Parliament House. And you're also, earlier that morning, introducing your documentary. You haven't finished the documentary yet, so you're just sharing footage to date, are you?
No, on that particular day, on the morning before that, you might have seen the invitation
Yeah.
go around. I've prepared a 1-hour presentation exploring what I've mapped and what I've seen. So what I do is I talk about the fact that I was a pro-renewable advocate, and then once you delve below the facade of renewables, you quickly discover that it's unachievable. We can't achieve 100% renewables.
Yeah.
And
So can I interrupt because?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for a minute, Stephen, please? Because we're 3/4 of the way through the hour. So, and we've understood what changes you've gone through in your life, why you've done those changes, and I happen to agree with you. You've also shown that you have no conflicts of financial interest. You're not tied up with anyone. Could you tell us what's driving this scam? And I'm thinking about if you could explain carbon dioxide certificates. I don't call them carbon certificates, carbon dioxide certificates. And you mentioned to me that wind and solar operators are selling offsets to carbon dioxide producers. For example, Anglo Coal is buying certificates from Triggy Forest Company to offset Anglo's carbon dioxide production. Simon Holmes at Court is making enormous money out of subsidies for solar and wind. Can you tell us specifically about how carbon dioxide certificates work and what's wrong with them?
Yeah, because I could never understand how renewable projects could actually make money.
They can't.
I couldn't understand it because I look at the mapping data, the wind generation data for Mount Emerald Wind Farm. Like I said, it doesn't generate in the year 2022. It generated zero electricity for like 66, 63 or 65 days, and then for 3 or 4 months on top of that, it's just really meaningless electricity generation, just crap electricity that just fluctuates.
That's almost half the year. It's zero or meaningless.
Yeah, but it doesn't generate the electricity when we need it. So a classic right now is that we've got a bit of a heat wave. It's a very hot week. And I've been watching the Mount Emerald Wind Farm, and we need electricity at 6 to 8 p.m. And it delivers nothing. So
Yep.
what do we do? Right now in Queensland, we're burning diesel. You look at the data for the last week, and between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. in Queensland, we're burning huge amounts of diesel to keep our lights on. That's how stupid it is. So we've got $2 billion worth of wind factory infrastructure in Queensland right now. That's operational. $2 billion. $2 billion. So Cooper Gap Wind Farm, Caban Wind Farm, Mount Emerald Wind Farm. So, and you got Hewenden and Windy Hill. You got more than $2 billion really if you add it all up. And all of that wind infrastructure is delivering no wind between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. at all at the moment. Because at the moment in North Queensland, we've got no wind. We've got the doldrums. We get a slight westerly in the wet season. So we're burning diesel at the moment. So I'm thinking, how do they make money? So, and I've still got more to learn about this. I'm not an expert. It's really hard to get to the bottom of it, but it's all about energy certificates. And then just recently, Chris Bowen released another thing called the Capacity Investment Scheme. I've got it here on the screen. So there's two lucrative deals that are available to wind factories and solar farms. The first system is called the certificates. Carbon certificates. This was actually introduced under the Turnbull government, the Liberal National Party government. So they are to blame for this.
Correct.
So what it is, it's to give. Yeah. So these certificates. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
No, keep going.
These certificates are designed to enable wind factory proponents the ability to provide security to lenders, to the banks. So, for example, Caban is I think it's $450 million project. No bank wanted to finance the Caban wind factory unless they had a system in place where they could provide security that they had a secure income going forward. So what the Turnbull government did is they said to these developers, to wind factories and the proponents, we'll give you $54 megawatt hour. We'll give you $54 megawatt hour certificates that you can then sell to big polluters. And then those big polluters give you that money, and then that enables you to provide certainty in income. Well, it delivers more income for you.
So just to jump in there, Stephen, normally with getting a loan from a lender to finance the future of your industry, your project, set it up, the lender would say, where's the future in this? Are you going to make money? Yes. So the banks were basically saying, you will not make money. But along comes the government and says, we're going to give you some money, and that will make the banks see that you're going to get that money regardless of how much electricity you produce. The banks are going to say, wonderful, this is wonderful. You know, so Warren Buffett, who's the world's most successful investor ever by a long, long way, he said, wind turbines are a hideous investment. That's not his exact word, but he said, wind turbines are a hopeless investment. Never get near them. Subsidized wind turbines, now that's a different deal. That's why he invests in wind turbines, because he collects the money off the government.
Yeah, because there's a guaranteed income. So the government issues certificates. So, for example, to cut it down in a nutshell. Twiggy Forest is building the Clark Creek wind farm right now as we speak, stage 1. And that involved clearing around 1,500 hectares of koala habitat. I've seen koalas there. I've ground truthed the site. So the bulldozers are there right now clearing that habitat, 1,500 hectares. Twiggy has already signed a deal that he'll sell the certificates to Anglo-American Coal to offset their Scope 2 carbon emissions. So under the RET system, big polluters need to buy these certificates to offset their pollution. So Anglo-American Coal have said to Twiggy, well, we'll buy those certificates off your wind farm. That way we become carbon neutral. We abide by the legislation that we're abating our carbon emissions, our Scope 2 carbon emissions. So they can carry on digging up coal and be carbon neutral in the process. And Twiggy Forest can then show the banks that he's going to sell these certificates to Anglo-American Coal. He's got a predetermined income coming in, and the banks will now lend him money to build the Clark Creek wind farm. So there's an important point in there, Stephen. Sorry for cutting you off, but it's really important. So the government who started this, taxpayers fund the government. So the citizens are paying for parasitic billionaires to get rich. That's the first thing. The second thing is, even if Anglo Coal, for example, as a coal producer, pays that money to one of these billionaires for a dodgy scheme that won't stand up on its own, that leads to higher coal prices, which leads to higher steel prices, higher electricity prices. The people are paying through the neck again. The people ultimately pay more. Or what could also happen is the biggest exporter of coal now is not Australia, it's Indonesia. And so they're not going to fall for this crap. So what's going to happen is they're going to keep exporting cheaper coal, and we will have to get more. We will go out of business, which puts tens of thousands of people out of work. Again, the people pay for it. The people pay for this 3 times, and that's. I know that you're annoyed about that, but keep going. Yeah, that's right. So it's very clear that renewable electricity is so expensive. Because you not only have to subsidise the construction costs of the infrastructure, but then there's no obligation for the developer of the wind farm to provide meaningful electricity because they've already got money coming in the door. This is the biggest form of greenwashing I've ever encountered in my career. This is greenwashing, because Anglo-American Coal is saying, oh, well, we're now carbon neutral. We've met the government's obligations of offsetting our emissions. You got Twiggy Forest, who was on 7:30 report the other night, saying that wind and solar will deliver the cheapest electricity prices, which is a complete scam. yet it's taxpayers that need to provide the transmission infrastructure for that wind farm to even be built.
I've got an important question for you soon, so I'm going to jump on because we've only got less than 5 minutes left. This is something I'm going to summarize quickly rather than ask you to explain, because I've done a lot of work on solar and wind and energy in general and climate, but sometimes you get hit between the eyes by something so blunt. And what Stephen said was that if you have a generator that's running at 10% capacity on average or 18% capacity on average, then you need to produce what you're supposed to produce, you need 10 times the number of turbines. They're only going to operate at 10%. Now that means you need 10 times the transmission. And then you add to that Stephen's truthful statement that the wind turbines and solar panels are miles from anywhere, and so that means the transmission costs are even higher. And as Stephen pointed out to me the other day, transmission costs were at 49% of the selling price. So what's happening is mums and dads are going to be paying through the neck for all the electricity that they use. And as Stephen's quite rightly said, we ain't seen nothing yet. If you think electricity prices are high now, they're going to be very high. But I always ask a guest, what do we do about it? What are the solutions, Stephen?
Yeah, just going back to that previous point, there's also the recent subsidies that Bowen put in, but I won't talk about that now, which is the capacity auctions, which is another big, it's an unbudgeted, we don't know how much that's going to cost taxpayers or electricity consumers, but we can talk about that next time.
So we've got a huge cost already. It's going to get far, far higher, and then there are unknowns on top of that. So we're in for a hell of a future. We've only got 3 minutes left.
Yeah, that Twiggy Forest Clark Creek wind farm, mind you, is a $2 billion project. $2 billion. So what can we do about it? What we need to do is we need to talk to friends and family at dinner parties. We need to talk to people. We need to talk to people on the streets about electricity, and tell them that the cost of electricity can never go down with a 100% renewable future. Talk to them about nuclear as being because climate change is such a big issue. I'm not going to talk about it now. I'd like to see decarbonisation, and nuclear to me is a part of it. We
disagree there, but that's fine.
Okay. But having said that, we only provide 1.3% of carbon emissions. So what we're doing is completely insane in terms of renewables. 100% renewables is insane. We need to talk to friends and family. We need to do presentations. We need to talk to politicians, and try to educate the public. A really big problem that we have is that the media aren't asking the hard questions.
Yep.
We need media to ask the hard questions. We need the media to ask Twiggy Forest, why are you saying that electricity prices can go down when you're building a $2 billion wind factory that can only provide 15 or 20% capacity factor, has a lifespan of 20 years, and then it needs to be decommissioned and replaced. And then you need to back it all up by batteries, which have a lifespan of 8 to 10 years and cost millions of dollars to maintain. And then we haven't even talked about the critical mineral mining and the rare earth mining that's required to facilitate all this. And the media just aren't asking any of the hard questions. They're just completely missing in action. They're completely believing the Greens and the conservation groups that renewables are going to somehow save us and keep our lights on.
When they're actually the cause of the problem. But what you said was the first solution is we have to wake up our fellow countrymen. We have to wake up people in the community that not only the fundamental need for electricity, which you've come to acknowledge, but the cost of that electricity. Because the number one factor in manufacturing, the number one factor in competitiveness now is the price of energy. It always has been. That's what's liberated humans from poverty in the last 170 years of the Industrial Revolution.
I totally agree. And I believe that we need to maintain in Australia, our standard of living, because if we can't maintain our standard of living, well, then we destroy everything. And so I'm a firm believer that we need cheap, abundant electricity. And I'm okay with coal plants going for a bit longer until we, have other solutions. But what I do know is that 100% renewables is not a solution. Yeah,
that's quite clear. So,
I also want
get out.
Just want to make sure. One more thing I do want to emphasise is that, there are certain renewables that are okay. Look, rooftop solar and so forth. And this is the problem we're having, is that we're just putting all renewable energy into one basket. And there are some aspects, like there's communities, there's regional communities that are self-reliant on renewable energy, whether it be solar or wind and small scale systems. And my brother-in-law is self-sufficient off the grid. So that's something we've got to communicate with the wider public as well. There's some aspects of renewables that are okay, but what we're talking about here, which is big industrial scale renewables, is completely delusional. Yeah. So
right. Yeah. So I have many more facts to present, but we could be going for two or three hours.
There's a lot to go through.
But I want to thank you, Stephen, very much, not only for appearing on the show with me, but for what you've done. Again, I have so much admiration for people who are embedded in an ideology, can see it's wrong, then not only acknowledge it's wrong, but do something about it. We still disagree on coal and carbon dioxide, but that's fine. We'll have another discussion about that.
Yeah, and that doesn't matter, because the discussion is about renewables. And
correct.
Renewables are not going to bring down, I believe, carbon emissions.
No.
And I'd like to talk about that as well, because the facts for carbon emissions from renewables are completely wrong. 7 grams per kilowatt hour for wind. But none of that is factoring in the destruction of forests, the short lifespan of the infrastructure, and all that infrastructure needs to be backed up and firmed by batteries and all that. And none of that is in those emission in that 7 grams.
Right, and I have a wonderful book here. It's called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein, a really bright young American, very, very well spoken. On page 49 of this edition, he says, steel and iron required per megawatt for wind, coal and natural gas. So for wind, it's 542.3 tons of iron and steel per megawatt of wind.
Yep.
For coal, it's 35.3. That's 1/15 of solar and wind. That's why solar and wind are resource hogs. They're huge, and the capital price is so high it will never make sense. But the other thing about it is wind produces so little that the cost per unit energy per megawatt hour is extremely high, and you can't get away from that unless you have subsidies. That's why they're telling us, Bowen and Co. and the Liberals too, that solar and wind are wonderful, but they won't get off the subsidies. If they're so wonderful, take off the subsidies. That's right. So is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No. I just thank you for having me, and thanks for having me. And I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
Yep.
In Canberra.
Same here.
And I think we just all need to keep ramming home the inefficiencies of renewables, the high price point, because I think at the end of the day, the way people are going to wake up to this is through higher power prices.
Yeah.
And because they're being led to believe by Chris Bowen that power prices can only go down with renewables, they can never go down. And mums and dads are going to start going, why are our electricity bills going up and up and up and up? And we need people like yourself, Malcolm, and others to say, well, this is why, because of the complete overbuild that's required for renewables, all the firming that's required, the battery backup, the pumped hydro systems that we need to build. We haven't even touched pumped hydro yet. And the transmission
That's
infrastructure.
Disgraceful, pumped hydro.
The pumped hydro is just insane. So I think it's really going to be through the electricity bills that people see in their mailboxes that the wider public are then going to start asking questions. Why are we being misled? Why are we being lied to by the federal government? People assume they're going to get cheaper power prices, and that's never going to happen. So at some point there's going to be a crunch point, and there's only there's only for so long that consumers can be given rebates off their power bills.
Well, I need to say something else there, Stephen, because you're selling yourself short. Around 2013, 14, I was in the Galileo movement and voluntary, entirely voluntary, working full time. I also had a very capable group of volunteers. One of them name was Paul. He said to me, we're not going to get anywhere until it hurts people in the hip pocket. He kept working because he didn't give up. He kept working, but I thought, yeah, he might be right. He is right, and you agree with him. But there's another factor that I've seen emerging now. The farmers, rural communities, and people like yourself who are genuinely interested in the natural environment are saying these things are highly damaging for the natural environment, and they're up in arms about it. And that's what's driving this rally on Tuesday. It's not electricity prices. It's the destruction of human habitat, the destruction of human communities, the destruction of natural environment. So I'm going to send you, as part of and we'll remember to put it on the link here, there's an article about Maurice Strong. This whole climate scam, fraud, the whole driving of solar and wind came from a man called Maurice Strong. I won't go into the details now because I'm attending to, but I won't. I'll resist. That man was an absolutely inhuman person. He wanted to control the world, literally his words. He saw this as an avenue to control the world. And I will put that article out. It's written by someone in the United States, I think. It shows what his real motives are and how he concocted the climate fraud. Until then, I want to thank, until the next show, I want to thank Stephen Nowakowski for doing what he's doing, for having the courage to do it. And until our next show, this is Senator Malcolm Roberts, staunchly pro-human, proud of who we are as humans, and a believer in the inherent goodness and care in human beings. Take a minute to appreciate the abundance and potential in and around all of us. Please remember to listen to and love one another, and give thanks for Stephen Nowakowski's wonderful revelations. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you everyone who's been watching.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm.